Welcome to Disconnected. Yesterday saw the intended resignation of Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland for many, many, many years. And obviously there has been a lot of talk this way and that way of, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? There's obviously a huge amount of people who adore her. She has been an absolute force in politics in the UK, even in Europe, dare I say. Her handling of COVID, her drive for independence. I'm biased, just so you know, whatever you're going to be hearing me say when it comes to Scotland and Scottish issues. I am not necessarily SNP supporter, because I don't really support one party per se. I like to see things at a case by case. I don't vote tactically. I vote for, when voting comes, I try to vote for the one I feel most accurately represents my vision. But I am 100% desperate for Scotland to have independence. So if there's any bias, it's definitely that. I wouldn't say I have bias towards Nicola Sturgeon, although I don't have a lot of bad things to say about her. However, Mr. Neil Oliver always has something to say. I think he's becoming an angry old man. He doesn't look like an angry old man because he still has the hair. Maybe I'm just jealous because I don't have any hair left, but I wouldn't mind to have a nice long flowing head of hair. But anyway, let's listen to what he has to say, because he obviously didn't like her.
I have to say, if it's a victory for those of us who knew how much damage Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP were doing to Scotland, then it's a Pyrrhic victory. She and her SNP have been there for a very long time now, and so much damage has been done. Scotland will take, even if the SNP were to disappear from the stage at the same time as First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, it will be generations before the hurt and the damage inflicted by them can.
The amount of people that hate Nicola Sturgeon and hate the SNP and hate independence, the will for independence in Scotland, always talk about the damage that they've done and the division that they've caused, and it's like, no, they haven't. There are people who want independence and there are people who don't, and just like in any case, there are a few people who get overexcited about one faction or the other. If you want to talk about people who cause division and hate, it's the way that the types of GB News or Neil Oliver speaks. And he literally has a video out like a day ago or something about how our political discourse is so ugly and abusive, rather than, really debating issues wholeheartedly. So it's a bit funny that this comes from him himself.
And heal. So it's something. It'll be good not to hear her voice so often any longer, but it's a long way back for Scotland from this point.
Just run me through what you think the lowlights of Nicola Sturgeon's legacy are for you. You've alluded to damage there. What damage?
Well, the whole thing, really. I remember she went on and on for a long time about...
What damage? Oh, the whole thing, really. The whole thing, like everything. Like all of it. It's all damaged.
Wanting to be judged by a record on education. A Scottish education when I was a kid was something that people bragged about. You wanted it to be known the world over that you had been educated in Scottish schools and at Scottish universities. That's long since ceased to be the case under the rule of the S.
That is not the case at all. So I have a lot to say. I have a lot of feelings about education in Scotland. So you can't put the universities in Scotland under the same frame as the schools, because there has been no damage done to the acclaim of Scottish universities, St Andrews, Edinburgh, the universities in Glasgow, Dundee, you name it. They're all highly, highly ranked, and they're also very, very well respected. The issue when it comes to the rankings, the PISA rankings, is mainly obviously about high school students, and it's their rankings judged on, I think, 15-year-old, and then they do like these tests about reading, writing, maths, stuff like that. And in that case, the rankings have fallen drastically in the world rankings. Now it has to be taken into context. Now I'm not making an excuse here, because I've been watching this very closely for the last few years, and the reason I have is because I have children in school in Scotland right now, and one of them is turning 17. They're in S5. If there is any impact in the education system on the education of my children, I would like to know what's going on. So I've been trying to get to the bottom of this, and I've got slightly divisive feelings about this. On the one hand, I 100% agree with the route that the Scottish education system is trying to do with children. So they're trying to get away from this learn, study, exam thing, and essentially it's that the typical old system of testing all the time, and then it ends up a case where students literally just study to pass exams and not really study to become fully rounded people for the future that are also adaptable to the ever-changing workplace. I mean, it is kind of important that people actually, the information is all online about why and how the curriculum for excellence is set up, and why they did it in the first place. And there's a couple of really good reasons. The main reason is that we don't know what the future holds for our kids. So we don't want to do the old thing where we tell our kids to become an accountant or become a doctor or something like that, because we don't know necessarily what the future will hold, what kind of jobs will be available, what will be the new big thing, because it's all kind of in turmoil. We never know. The world is changing really fast all the time, and probably will do so more in the future. So the whole idea of the curriculum for excellence is that they have a broad knowledge, they are full human beings when it comes to be able to have rationale, to be able to debate, to know their maths, to know their reading and writing, but it's all kind of aimed at a... Sorry, 1 second, I'm going to have to mute this. Sorry. So it's about creating a completely different education system and trying to prepare children for the future that lies ahead, and not for the past that was. Many other countries implement a very similar thing. I mean, Scotland is not some sort of country that's trying to trailblaze here, and they are looking at the Nordics, especially the Finnish kind of style. Now, what I could add to that is that I'm not so sure if the implementation is done very well. But obviously, when you do something like that, when you don't focus so much on the exams and the marks in the exams and all these specific points, I can only assume that it will also lead to a certain that the marks won't reflect. Well, the marks will reflect a lower kind of status. However, there's actually a lot to be said about it. I mean, one of the other things, I don't like going backwards and forwards, but my head is not with me this morning. So one of the other things that is really important about the curriculum for excellence, especially in the primary years, is that it identified, which has been long overdue, probably 200 years overdue, that children are pretty much all capable of doing well in school, but at different times, which means like if somebody is 11 years old and they are in their, let's say, P6, right? They might be a little bit behind in their development. So instead of making that P5 the determinant if they pass P5, it doesn't really necessarily work. So they give them like a 2 to 3 year set of a time scale in which to achieve a certain set of things. So instead of being, P1, P2, 3, P4, P5, P6, 7, although they do have those years, they have like a certain attainment that they need to reach within, let's say, P1, 2, and 3, and then 4, 5, and 6, and 7, etc. So they give the kids a little bit of a gap because they might be a year ahead or they might be a year behind in their own development and capability to do that work. But that doesn't mean they are eventually not able to do that work. And that also carries across to a degree in high school. So it is a little bit more of a loose thing. The other thing that where I have a worry is that a huge amount of the actual grading and judging of the child's competence really is down to the teachers. So you also really have to rely that the teachers are on the ball, right? And they know what they're doing. And so I think there's a lot of things here which kind of work together to make this a really good system, but open to a lot of failures as well. So personally, I 100% agree with the curriculum for excellence, but I do have my worries that it might not necessarily work unless you really know what you're doing. So the other thing about it is if you do a little bit of search on actually the PISA results and stuff like that, a lot of researchers aren't entirely like, they don't necessarily think that, falling in the league tables is a sign of the education system failing, for example, because there's a lot of factors that go into it. It's a bit like polls. If you say, we think this party is going to win because, the latest poll said so, and so you can't really take it at face value because they only surveyed like a small amount of people and they possibly surveyed the wrong area. And that's the same with this. There's only a certain amount of children who take these tests. They have changed the way the tests work. Apparently they're all done online. So they think that maybe there's it's not the fact that the kids possibly don't know the work, but there might also be a technical kind of barrier there that might have caused these the ranking to slip. However, saying all that, I'm not so sure I know 100% the answer, but it is not as dire as is projected here.
SNP and Nicola Sturgeon, to such an extent that the SNP have taken Scottish schools off of the international league tables because our performance internationally is so lamentably poor.
So I've tried to see if I can find any evidence of that. I don't think they have taken them off the international league tables. I can't find any article, any news about that. If I'm wrong there, please correct me down below.
So, education has gone down the toilet under the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon. Health is on the slide. There are places in the East End of Glasgow where life expectancy for a Scottish man is lower than people in sub-Saharan Africa.
I hate this. This angers me so much. So, the life expectancy of a male in Glasgow when I moved to this country in 1999 was 56. Glasgow was deemed the poor man of Europe, the unhealthy man of Europe, the drunk man of Europe, the drug center, the gang center of Europe. It was literally like one of those cities that had this horrendous like stigma to it. This is nothing new. 56 was the life expectancy of a male in Glasgow. That slowly rose. That figure, I don't know where it is now, but I know that it has been going up. Now, if you think about this is a man who complains about the SNP, who's done nothing but try to bring equality to Scottish people. the system under which people had a life expectancy of 56 in Glasgow was a Tory and Labour legacy, right? It has gone up after that. So it is insane to use this as an argument.
Drugs deaths are way up. Crime is up. She gets her infrastructure.
Crime is up in the whole of UK. Drugs is up in the whole of UK. I do acknowledge that Glasgow has a very severe drug problem, and it's going worse. However, it is not. People keep right. So people moan about pro-independence people making excuses that the SNP always blames the budget of the UK on failures. But why wouldn't you? If you get pocket money from somebody and you're supposed to make things work, you cannot blame yourself because you only received so much pocket money to deal with an issue, right? So if you need finance, if you need money to throw at something like, let's say, policing or crime prevention or health or whatever, and somebody only gives you, shortchanges you all the time, then obviously you are not going to be able to fix those problems. It is the dumbest argument.
Structure efforts, the two rusting hulks of ferries that have cost the Scottish taxpayer hundreds of millions of pounds.
The ferries I've spoken about before. The ferries are here in my hometown. I think it was a mistake, to be fair, in a way, because politicians got involved with the natural cycle of getting work done. So the whole tendering process, I think, was a little bit skewed and not the way it should have been done. It should have gone out for tender. But the reasoning behind them was very clear. They wanted to save a shipyard in our town. The shipyard was going to close, and so they basically made this effort to give it to this shipyard to build. And if you look at the... because our local newspaper has covered a lot of this over the years, it is definitely a classic situation of here's a private person getting a public contract and then absolutely ripping the fucking piss out of it. It is as clear as that. And I'm not saying there's no fault on the government on this, but, for anybody to criticize... I think here's my problem with this whole thing of being so overcritical with the SNP. Or the Scottish government in general, even in the past, even before the SNP. I think my biggest problem with criticizing them is this. They are politicians, they have their fault, they fuck up very often. But nowhere near the degree that the other political parties are, especially currently. I mean, you cannot even mention anything that the SNP have done wrong if you consider the alternative of Westminster. The amount of corruption and nepotism and cronyism and money laundering facilitation in London that is happening right now, you name it. You cannot even... Why even bother criticizing the SNP? I think I said something wrong there. Seriously, I mean, obviously you have to criticize your politicians, and I'm the first person to criticize them. But here's a person who wants... He obviously wants the UK to govern Scotland. He obviously wants Westminster to be in charge. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so anti a very good party that's been very good for Scotland. And the only people who really are so vilely hateful of the SNP are really unionists at the end of the day. Queen-loving bastards, right? So that means these are people who want, to have a monarchy which are unelected. They want the Tories to fuck them up the ass all the time. Literally all the time. They have no pride in their own country. They have no faith in their own country to manage their own affairs. They have no faith. They have no understanding of politics. For example, if we get independence, we have a clean slate. We are a democratic country, and we will choose whatever leader whatever party we want to lead. And then, they are much closer to home and we can hold them much more accountable. This whole hatred towards independence and pro-independence parties is what causes somebody to talk shite like this. It is not a reality.
And there are still no ferries to replace those that are required. The bridge across the River Forth, that has to be closed when there's ice on the wires because of the failures there.
Failures. It is science. It is normality. There is no way to stop that. It's going to happen. You have winds blowing high up, which are -degrees, and it causes ice to form. That happens on any high thing. It just happens, right? But here's something that he misses on the Forth Bridge. The new bridge was built under budget and ahead of time. So when it comes to government contracts, this is not a good example. Because under the SNP, that bridge was built under budget, which never happens in public contracts, and ahead of time. He somehow failed to miss that. And actually, that bridge is open 99.99999% because it's only under very, very weird circumstances that it has to close because it's got these high masts and then ice forms and that ice can then fall onto the road, so they close the road. The previous road had to be closed all the time because it didn't take the wind shears into account there, and the wind can get quite high, so above a certain wind mileage, then they have to take cars, especially like high-sided vehicles, off there. But that's not mentioned.
It's just a long list, but most profound is the ill feeling that's been generated by all the years of incessant calls for one referendum after another. Yeah. That has harmed the society, the community spirit of Scotland. I mean, I wouldn't want to say irreparably, but very, very severely. And that kind of society.
Let me get this off my chest here. Speaking directly to the likes of Neil Oliver, who is supposedly a historian, because he did all these history programs, even though he called the whole Jacobite era a civil war, but that just shows you how deluded the man is. Okay. If you have a government with a devolved parliament, and you are not in full control over your own fiscal policies, i.e. you are not completely in control about how much money you can make, how much money you can spend, how much tax you can bring in. You don't have any control over your borders. You don't have any control over anything other than just what you spend your petty cash on that you receive from somebody else. You will never, ever, ever be able to solve the issues that really matter, because you will always be hamstrung by the amount of cash that's in your pocket, which is given to you by somebody else, which somebody else decides on you. It's like when somebody gives you a certain amount of money and tells you to buy a car with it and then complains about the fact that you bought a shitty little car that breaks down all the time, when essentially they didn't give you enough money. It's like that. So the only way that Scotland even has a chance to solve endemic problems that have been caused by 200 years of unionism, of Tories and Labour governments, is if they govern themselves completely. That is the only way. And that is why the likes of the SNP and people who are for independence constantly go on about independence. Because every single problem that you present to a politician in this country can only be properly fixed if you have full control of everything. Now, if you fuck up your economy and you can't fix them, that's a different story. But the only chance that you have to possibly do something about it is if you govern yourself. That's it. If you are always hamstrung by somebody else's, handouts, you are not going to fix anything. And that is why this is an ongoing, all-consuming issue.
Mental hurt will take a long time to fix.
Well, indeed. I mean, I was floating quite jokingly, really, the idea now that it might be a good time for a snap referendum, because given the fact that independence is around 12 points behind in the polls, it might actually put it to bed for a long time. But
it's not 12 points behind. It is 12 points behind depending on which poll you look at. There's about 10 different polls, and some show the majority for independence, some show, more support for no. And if you then look at the polls themselves and which one reflect which kind of outcome, you can kind of quite clearly see why. So this is not a fact. Polls are not a fact. And it's funny because polls are always like, oh, look, you're behind in the polls. But if we're ahead, it's like, yeah, but polls don't mean anything. It's unbelievable. Bullshit.
Of course, I don't really mean that. Neil, you've rattled off a huge list there. Absolutely. And spot on in terms of some of the negatives you pointed out there.
Well, it wasn't really
Why is it then that she was so good at winning elections?
That's a question that I struggle to answer. It's to my dismay. It has a great deal to do with the nature of the system that was put in place into the devolved.
Okay, so this is hilarious. So firstly, he didn't ask him to mention any of all the good things that the SNP have done, like free prescriptions, like baby boxes, like free education, like higher paid nursing staff. And we do actually have lower waiting times in Scotland than we have in England in the majority of cases. Right? They're not talking about the land reform. They're not talking about any of the stuff that the SNP have done that are good. They have not talked about how they froze council tax through the harsh years because people would not have been able to afford it. They're not talking about the child payments. They're not talking about any of the good things that the SNP have done. They only talk about the bad things, the few bad things, and then they only mention 2 or 3, and then they say it's like a long list, right? This is the kind of discourse that is so damaging to reality, because anybody watching who's all fanboy of GB News or Mr. Jesus here, they will then not think of the other things. So they will never get a clear message. They'll only get that bias message that this person wants them to have. Because they don't even bother going any further and thinking, well, actually, let's have a quick look. I mean, have you ever seen some angry old fascists going like, oh, let's see what, what the SNP might have done that is good? No, they won't do that. They're going to listen to this guy and they're going to go, oh, this is cool. All right, so they must be awful. Okay.
Scottish Assembly. It was supposed to be a system that did not gift an overall majority to any one political party.
Wrong. Bullshit all the way to the fucking cave where he came out of and back. The voting system in Scotland, when the devolved parliament was set up, was not set up so that one party can't have an overall majority. It was set up so that the SNP can never have an overall majority. It was set up in the favour that Labour will always have the overall majority. It was deliberately set up like that. And now it bit them in the ass because they fucked up the people. Because this is what's so difficult about this whole thing. The whole fact that the SNP have been in power in the majority for two elections is obviously the will of the people, because number one, they came from far behind. They had to deal with all the negative press that they received from all sides. They had to deal with all the lies. They had to fight all of that, including independence, which is controversial, and still managed to get the majority in the Scottish government, which means that there must be something from the people inherently that trust them more than all the others. This idea that they don't know why the SNP is a majority and they don't really have the majority, it just boggles my mind how people can make that argument when against every obstacle they have managed to get there.
but it was such a hodgepodge, so badly designed by the Labour establishment that put it in place, thinking that they and they alone would bestride Scottish politics for an eternity, as they had done for generations previously. I don't think they thought that they had to take too much care over it, because they thought that they would continue to run Scotland, and obviously we all know what actually happened. So there was it's an unfortunate quirk of the system that the SNP learned to game, to give them a disproportionate voice. This incessant use, Nicola Sturgeon was at it again today, talking about the will of the Scottish people. The will of the Scottish people has never been for breaking Scotland out of the United Kingdom.
Bullshit. So let's dissect this absolute hogwash, right? Number one, they were voted in, and then they had 2 votes and a majority in Parliament. On all 3 of them, their manifesto clearly stated independence as one of their main objectives. That means people voted for the SNP very much knowing, brought them into the majority knowing that they are for independence. So if you want to take a vote, if you want to live in a democracy, and you do your polls and you do your voting the way you do, then that is the will of the people now. We want independence. 2014 was won on fear by the No campaign. How? Very simple. They said we were going to have to go out of the EU, which nobody here wanted, which was very clear in the Brexit voting and the Brexit results. They were making all the majority of the voters, which are the older voters, they made them think that they're somehow not going to have a pension anymore. They made all these crazy ideas. They brought up all these crazy ideas, which were obviously, for anybody who's got a little bit of brains, would know that it is just a fear-mongering and lies. Just like the Brexit vote, just like the Brexit, they won that campaign because it was like a change, right? People don't want a change. They're kind of, I prefer the evil that I know than the one I don't know. So it was so hard to win that because people tend to just want to live their lives. And at the time we had a huge European population here, so they all went and they would have voted to stay because they feared. Number one, they don't really understand the dynamic between Westminster and Scotland, so they think we're all just one happy family when we absolutely aren't. Secondly, they would have feared that they would have to be thrown out of the country because Scotland would have to leave the EU. The currency, the SNP, well, the Yes campaign completely fucked up the currency debate because it just wasn't an argument at all. And and then having received 45% of the vote, if it wasn't for the BS and if people were a little bit more informed, we would have won that. I am 100% convinced. And the polls up to right now is very clear that it is constantly swings a little bit below 50. If you take all the polls into account, like all of them, and you kind of average them out, you'll notice that the independence for and against is always a little bit under 50%, and then over 50%, a little bit under. So it kind of depends. And I wouldn't be surprised if we had a vote that our chances now are damn good. And that would mean it would be democratic.
Kingdom. It was last meaningfully measured in 2014 with the referendum, when the resounding result was that Scotland wanted to remain within. This incessant way in which the SNP and Sturgeon have harped on and on about the will of the voice of the Scottish people, when they never have spoken for the entirety of the Scottish people. They speak for the SNP and their supporters, who are a minority of Scots.
You have set up your country in such a way that the majority of a vote is the democratic will. So the majority of the vote goes somewhere, and then you say, "Oh no, it's not the democratic will of the people." But if Labour or the Tories would have won, I don't know, 30-40%, then it would have been suddenly the majority democratic vote. I hate politicians.
I think, to be honest with you, I heard you asking the questions earlier of Darren. I would say that she's gone now, and I think we saw Jacinda Ardern walk off the stage in New Zealand before she was pushed. I think for different reasons, I think we're going to see politicians around the world in the same predicament. The last 2 years, which have seen mishandling of the entire world by overmighty politicians drunk on the power that the pandemic handed them, they caused immeasurable harm economically, to health, just to the spirit of nations. All of that's coming home to roost.
And you think,
I think we're going to see...
So I unfortunately feel like I have to agree with him here. Politicians have taken this opportunity, and you couldn't say if it was the politicians who took that opportunity. And I think people like Nicola Sturgeon and Jacinda actually took this opportunity, and they did this really with the thought of trying to save lives. I'm going to give them that benefit of the doubt. But there are obviously more nefarious actors around who used COVID and brought in legislation that are harmful to our society, and more draconian that they're getting away with. So I kind of have to agree with him here. I think there is a lot that needs to be reversed very, very quickly. Some of the legacy of the COVID time. But anyway, that's my rant over. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.